Okay. And now we're going live. Have a great event.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Chaney Kwak presenting his new book, The Passenger, How a Travel Writer Learned to Love Cruises and Other Lives from a Sinking Ship. He will be talking with Paul Lisicky, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Chaney, Paul, and the team at David R. Godin Publishing for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. There's just a few housekeeping things to go over before we get started tonight. In your Zoom webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. So the exact location depends on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting them there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Passenger, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations from 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Chaney's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I've dropped the buy link in the chat and I'll drop it again in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Paul Lisicky. He's the author of 6 books, including Later, My Life at the Edge of the World, one of NPR's best books of 2020. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Plowshares, Tin House, and many other magazines and anthologies. His awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and National Endowments for the Arts. He is an associate professor in the MFA program at Rutgers University Camden and lives in Brooklyn, New York. He will be speaking with our featured author, Chaney Kwak. He has been traversing the globe for more than a decade to write about food and travel. His work appears regularly in newspapers such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, as well as magazines such as Afar, Condé Nast Traveler, and Travel and Leisure. Mr. Kwak teaches nonfiction writing at the Stanford Continuing Studies program and lives in San Francisco. His new book, The Passenger, takes readers for an unforgettable journey from the Norwegian coast to the South China Sea, from post-World War II Korea to pandemic-struck San Francisco. Aboard a sinking cruise ship, a journalist faces death and reconsiders life. This book has been praised by such acclaimed writers as Alexander Chee, E.J. Koh, Ted Conover, Laurie Ostlund, and tonight's interviewer, Paul Lisicky, who says, "If I were aboard a ship in trouble, I'd want no other travel companion than Chaney Kwak. Down to earth, funny, irreverent, vulnerable, candid, The Passenger is wise in the way of the best books in that it subverts all the expected tropes of its narrative. Along the way, it thinks about so much: migration, race, art, class, work, relationships, and by its final pages, it's no longer the story of just one person, but a song of interconnectedness, a realization of all the other lives that make one's little time on Earth possible. On top of that, it's a total page turner." Chaney is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Paul and with all of you. Please take it away, Chaney.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for such kind words. And thank you, Greenlight, for hosting this event. Please order a book. It doesn't have to be The Passenger, any book from Greenlight. Later by Paul Lisicky, really great book. The Narrow Door, can go on and on, but so thank you, Greenlight. I'm going to read really quickly from towards the beginning, but not the opening of the book. Am I having fun all alone on a cruise, the playground of couples and families? In fact, would it shock you to hear that I've willingly gone on not one, but 2 cruises this month, back to back? 3 weeks ago, I boarded a luxury Italian cruiser from Bali. And if that sentence makes you want to punch me in the face, I'm right there with you. I had a butler with the most erect posture unpack my cheap clothes into hard mahogany drawers before wiping down my battered carry-on. I took Balinese cooking classes, got kneaded by masseuses like a lump of dough, and drank bottles of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I donned the bow tie and sashayed across the deck under the stars. The ship glided across the South China Sea, which I later described in a magazine article as, forgive me, silky. Then I disembarked and flew from Manila over to Bergen, Norway to do it all over again in the opposite hemisphere. I know. Being a travel writer sounds glamorous on paper. And yes, I have come across plenty of folks who could afford to think of themselves as glamorous long before they ever sold a single piece of writing. A tribe that knows how to swill with Clico before noon and not feel even a tiny bit buzzed or guilty. I, on the other hand, snuck into this trade by reviewing hostels and writing penny-pinching advice while attending graduate school in Berlin on a German government scholarship. I've approached every cruise I've taken, like Margaret Mead visiting Papua New Guinea, the most foreign of environments that grows somehow more alien each time I inhabit it. That may be why I kept getting similar assignments from editors without trying, akin to sending a puzzled pacifist to interview Jean-Claude Van Damme while he punches Steven Seagal to pulp. That Bali cruise, the editor-in-chief of a top travel glossy had emailed me out of the blue. The Norway cruise, I've been summoned by the head of a can't buy it, so you need to be in the know monthly, found only in libraries of country clubs. Or maybe it was all just a joke, born not out of intention, but from the very unfairness that drives the world of freelance writers. I happen to be available. I knew better than to decline the assignments tossed into my lap. No, wait, this is disingenuous. Work wasn't the only reason that sent me on month-long trips. If I wanted to make money, and lots more of it, I could have stayed in San Francisco, where I live, and worked for one of the social media services that everyone hates but uses hourly. Something else was keeping me away. 1 week ago, on my first night on the Norway cruise, I startled awake sometime between midnight and dawn to see a chartreuse wave shimmer across the television screen. Jet lag had fogged my brain, and it took me a few seconds to realize I had fallen asleep watching the live camera feed from the bridge, the ship's control room. I stared at the screen. The Northern Lights. That's the reason I was there. I'd been hired to rhapsodize about crystalline fjords, pristine mountains, and the tastefully decorated ship whose interior is so Nordic that even all the wood fixtures are blonde. But the protagonist of this article was to be the Aurora Borealis, the notoriously fickle light show that takes place in the Earth's northernmost extremes. Without seeing it, I have no story. And without a story, my article would sputter out and fetch me nothing more than the dreadful consolation prize for freelancers, a kill fee of a couple of $100. I sprang out of bed and ran to the top deck. Blades of Arctic air slashed my face. I spun around and around looking. Icy mountains carved geometric outlines into the night sky, bright with the moon and stars, but no northern lights anywhere. Defeated, I trudged through the maze of hallways. A cruise ship is a city, a pulsing entity with its own rhythm and character. An invisible network of wires and pipes prop up a thriving economy. And like any other city, it can be a very lonely place, especially at night when it shines harshly for the workers and insomniacs who wonder as if stuck in the time zone of their faraway homelands. And there's no loneliness greater than the kind you feel when you're surrounded by hundreds, thousands of others. Back in my cabin, I call the front desk. No northern lights tonight. The infrared makes everything look green, said a chatty receptionist. What you see is not real. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. One of the things I love about this book, Chaney, is the voice. There's always a lightness. I was trying to think of words, and I mean lightness in a musical sense. I was trying to think of words this afternoon that came to mind as I thought of the voice in the book. And one of them was agile, one was nimble. I feel like the book is always animated and alive on the page. It's not, I don't think there's ever a dutiful patch. And there are books that I love that I abide their dutiful patches. And we know what it's like to come across a book where it feels like the voice is walking through tar. And that's never the case with The Passenger. And I felt it right away. In spite of all the gravity of the book, there was the pleasure of a musical cadence. And I wonder if you read your work aloud as you're writing it, or whether you read your work aloud as an editing tool, because it seems to be so aligned to your particular voice box and the way you breathe.
Oh, thank you. That's a really big compliment. But actually, I hate reading aloud. And when
Oh well.
oh well, and my when The Passenger's audiobook rights sold, my first question was, oh my God, are they going to make me read it? Because I really don't want to. So I was very relieved to hear that they were going to hire a professional actor. But regarding that lightness of the voice, it took me a long time to embrace how I sound, and not just my voice. But I always thought, and I've been at this long enough, I've been trying to write a book for longer than I'd like to admit. And I always thought that a good book, a literary book, has to be serious, and it has to be like, it had to be like sad or tragic, or I don't know, not funny, anything but funny. And it took me a long time to come around and realize that I can only sound like myself, which is kind of funny, sad, I guess.
Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it. I mean, that the voice feels very marbled to me. It feels very flexible, and that voice can be so funny at the top of the page, and then just like slide into another tone by the time we're at the bottom. And the presence of humor still manages to infuse the voice as it develops. It moves. It moves like the way a mind moves. It
Sure.
contracts and swells.
Thank you.
That's the way.
Just FYI, the video that keeps popping up with my name is actually my dad. I sent him the wrong link, so he's joining us as a panelist and getting kicked off. I should text him. But going back to the voice thing, actually, I have to mention that it is actually, a lot of my voice comes from my parents, actually, even though, we don't communicate in English at all. It's all Korean, but I think I got my dad's self-deprecating humor and my mom's shady humor. But I think their humor is also always kind of imbued with a kind of sadness that comes from the kind of lifetime of experiences I've had. And I was kind of a surprise child who came along late, and I've been told that I sound older, or I write older than I actually am, and I wonder if it's actually from my parents. And that kind of humor, I think, I don't know, the saddest things. I think we've all had the experience where we cried and cried until we kind of started feeling not giddy, but laughing a little bit. I think there are two emotions that are actually not too distant from each other, at least for me anyway. So when I write, I think a lot of things I write tend to be funny, sad / sad.
Right. Yeah, that's your signature.
I like to hope so. I don't know if I have a signature per se.
I think you do. I was going to ask about, the word structure always seems so, serious. But I was thinking about the beauty of this particular structure, and I was thinking, how would it look like if I tried to draw it? And I was thinking of a core and all these branches coming off the core. And I was wondering if that picture, that vision seemed true to you. And if so, like, how do you convey, how do you develop a structure like that while still giving the reader the story, the sense of forwardness that they crave?
Well, first of all, I would love to see that drawing or painting if you ever get around to it. I never thought of it that way, and I never chart or outline anything I write. Writing is really funny because it's really, it's not how we think, right? Our thoughts are never linear, but most books tend to be at least the traditional narrative, which I like. Actually, I'm a bit of a traditionalist in many ways. I like full sentences, not fragments, and I like good stories and narrative arcs and whatnot. So, and those books are not actually biologically how we think, right? We don't think from point A to point B. So writing, to me, it almost seems like this is the only way I could ever write, which is to say, even though it's in a linear form of a book that starts from page 1 to whatever, it has to jump around and it has to tell many different stories at once, and sometimes get to a point where it's scary to touch upon a subject. So back off and talk about something funny, sort of how I operate, poke fun at myself a little bit, just as I learned from my dad. And then we approach that kind of scary subject again and again, so that what I really wanted to say in The Passenger, I think, doesn't really come out until like page 100 and whatever, right? Well past 100 pages. I think it's because it takes me a long time to approach that point. But in terms of the drawing, I'm still kind of stuck on that. I'm visualizing it. And are you thinking more like a tree with branches, or?
Yeah, a tree with branches might be more accurate and comprehensible. Yeah, I mean the tree trunk being the story of the ship, and the linear story of however many hours you were on the ship. But that story needs all of its branches in order to feel whole and layered. I mean, one of the things I love about the book isn't it's not just simply the stepping away from the subject at hand and coming back, but it's like the wonderful sense of juxtaposition and the little conversations that are made between element to element to element. Like the book, there's a life in the book between those spaces that's like a further dimension to what is being captured in the voice. So.
Well, you said it in a much more intelligent way than I could ever articulate, but I would say, yes, that's what I was going for. Yes. I am actually fascinated by what's unsaid and, the blank page. And maybe that's a Korean thing again. My storytelling is rooted in how my family communicates. I have 2 sisters, and all this, wonderful stories. I mean, they're my first storytellers, right? And if you're in a Korean family, you learn to read between the lines and understand what's unspoken as much as what's spoken. Mm-hmm. I've always been fascinated with that. So even writing a book in English in the tradition of, a Western storytelling, I was still really kind of wondering, what can I get away with not saying, because I think there's a lot of pain in there that I never actually articulate as such. And on the surface, it's about a cruise gone wrong, right? It's a luxury cruise ship loses power in the middle of a storm, and people, spoiler alert, all survive. It could have been just one sentence. And the question is then, what more can I say by not saying anything?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was wondering about what you've written. Sounds like hundreds of travel pieces. You've written short stories. You've worked on novels, and I wonder what it felt to write this book after having written that other work? Did you feel that those other projects taught this book, or was, what, or does this feel like its own animal?
Yes, to both. Yes, it felt like a completely different animal because it serves me right to debut with a memoir, because I spent my entire writing life kind of swearing I would never, ever, because it's so, I'm a private person. How could I ever write a memoir, right? So it serves me right. At the same time, this is the product of the pandemic, right? I couldn't have done this without being locked down at home, and being sick of the Tiger King, and having to do something. But really, more than anything else, the pandemic recast my experience through a completely different lens. Because until then, it really was about, well, I was on a cruise, and then things went wrong, and then I was fine. But during the pandemic, I realized that what does it mean to be confined and trying to change directions when you feel so utterly helpless? And I think that's something we can all kind of identify with. But in terms of the actual writing itself, absolutely. I mean, I brought out all the whistles and stops that everything that I had in my toolbox, just because when you're writing a book, and I've seen enough friends debut to know that you can never take anything for granted. I've seen so much more, like such talented, much more talented friends who send out their manuscripts and not get published, or get published and not get any attention. So I knew that I might have 1 to 0 chance, and I wanted to use everything I had, which meant that over the years of trying to write finish a novel and abandoning many of them, the kind of things I picked up from amazing teachers I've been lucky to have, and a lot of peers by reading their work, I got to use them. So, fast forward, spring back, and, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder, will you be a different, this is so hypothetical, will you be a different fiction writer if you decide, or when you decide to go back to, say, one of those novels you put aside, or to work on another one? Did you learn something about structure in the writing of The Passenger that illuminated some of your other work?
Well, for one, I learned to finish something. So, okay, yeah. I've done it. But yeah, I'd like to hope so. But more than any kind of techniques or craft-oriented things, I think what I learned was to be really vulnerable and metaphorically naked. There's a lot of stuff in there that I'm really scared of my loved ones reading. I have a niece who's 15, and I just keep thinking, oh, I just really hope she doesn't read this. But you can't choose who picks up your book, right? And sometimes a book will find its way to people who really need to read it, be it, a total stranger. And that's the beauty of writing a book, right? Putting something out there that doesn't belong to you anymore. So the flip side of that is that you can't control who gets to read it. But by publishing, I kind of learned to be naked and slightly less uncomfortable with it. So hopefully that's going to make me a little less scared and more courageous writing.
That's great. And you can't, you have no control over how the work is read. I think our presumption is that when we're writing a memoir, the reader is like looking at the eye, the author of the book, when in fact they're more likely thinking about themselves and alchemizing their own experience into reading.
I hope so. I really hope so, because when I first held the book, and it was such a foreign experience, this piece of dead wood and more dead wood in my hands, I was really touched, but also felt not alienated, but separated from it. I really realized like, this is it. I'm the unfit mother who's gonna give this up and it's going to have its own life, and I wish it well. It's my duty to support it from afar, but really I have no control. And it goes both ways, right? Someone might completely misunderstand what you're trying to do, and that's that. But on the other hand, someone like you might come along and say these really incredibly intelligent things, and you just have to sit there and nod and go, yeah, that's what I planned, sure.
Is it rude to ask you what you might have cut from the book? I'm always interested in, in how a piece of narrative nonfiction is written, and the question of borders and what we choose, like what finally gets on the page, and how constraints are drawn, thematic choices have to be engaged in order for a reader to experience the book, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I can start with some of the easier ones I can answer. I cut out some parts that I put in perhaps with readability in mind, and in the end, they weren't quite true to the book. So one example was I really wanted to make it more suspenseful, and there was a whole section told from the point of view of the rescue diver that I interviewed, because the passenger is super personal, but there are a couple of people I interview, including a rescue diver who jumped out of a helicopter, went down to the ship, and started ferrying people one by one up to the sky. And it was almost like some action film, fanfic. And then I actually sent parts of the manuscript to a few people, not for approval, because I think there's a danger in getting things approved by people, but I wanted to fact check things. And the sections that were told from these third person points of view were needed to be fact checked for journalistic and ethical reasons. So I ran by them and said, I can't promise I'll change anything, but point out anything that's factually wrong. And the rescue diver came back to me and said, that particular helicopter has no skids. And because I had this whole section about he was holding onto the skid and about to jump down. And then that made me realize, I really don't have any right to write this, actually. And in the end, I think it worked out better because I was overdoing it, I think. Other things that didn't make it in there, some of the most painful parts of the last few years, certainly. I didn't put them down, but I think they're in there between the lines. And, whether a reader picks up on them or not is really not up to me. But I think I've done my job not writing them, if that makes any sense. So
I think the pain is often suggested in a slant way. I mean, maybe this is too forthright, but I'm thinking about how you write about the end of the relationship. Is it with Hannes? Is that?
Yes, Hannes.
Yeah. I was thinking about how the sadness of that is often conveyed through some of the emotional content of some of the other sections that abut that.
Yeah. I mean, the book is not about the relationship, but the book is informed by that relationship. And you're right. I think a lot of the sadness that permeates the book isn't necessarily from the cruise ship experience, because being scared is different from being sad, obviously. Yeah. So amidst all that suspense and also a lot of comedy, I think, because it's kind of a funny book, I'd like to think. There's an underlying sadness that comes from, that's informed by the relationship as seen from the point of view of now, right? It was recast one more time through the pandemic. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but when you read that, I think it'll make sense. So
yeah. There's something so fascinating about the emotional terrain of the ongoing averted disaster. I don't think I've ever seen that particular state conveyed, period. And like, we know at the beginning that our speaker is going to be okay, but we know that it's going to be scary and life-changing. And I'm not even sure this is a question that's very well formulated, but I thought about an experience that I had about 20 or so years ago when I was on a plane that was about to crash. And between the announcement that we were supposed to go into crash position and between the eventual landing, it was about 40 minutes, but that space of 40 minutes really did change my life. And I think that you're writing about a similar experience, and that it leans on everything.
And that's what's so great about literature, right? That we get to play God and mess with time, because that's what we get to do in books. And I made a conscious choice to really linger over a few seconds around the initial engine failure, and then I'll just gloss over 10 hours, right? It's so fun. I love doing that. But you're right. How do you tackle an experience like that in writing, right? Which is so different from movies or roller coaster ride, and it's not about using, I don't think it's in the vocabulary per se. You can't say it was thrilling and expect people to feel that kind of emotion. I can't really explain how, but can you? I don't know. I don't want to turn this into a master class, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
It feels multi-layered on an emotional level, and there's that sense of dread permeating every moment, and we can tell the speaker uses humor and communication as a tool to get through those moments of dread. And then there's also the absurdity of everyday life still continuing as the ship is in this precarious position. One of the scenes that's so shocking to me is when you go back into the room after being away from the room and just everything has been made up, or it's
so creepy, right? You walk into this room knowing exactly what had happened in the last 27 or 24 hours, and the movie's cued to the exact point where it had stopped before the incident. The room is immaculate, everything's been replaced, and you kind of think, am I being gaslighted here? Like, are we pretending like nothing happened? But you're right, that kind of normalcy, there's something really nefarious about that normalcy too, where, the ship literally turned up, well, not upside down, but almost turned upside down, yet the social hierarchy never changed, right? Throughout the night, all these crew members stayed up, feeding us and cleaning toilets. My God, they were cleaning toilets, right? And keeping certain crew members out of sight because they weren't fit to be seen. So people who work in the deepest depths of the ship were brought up to a different place so that they wouldn't interact with any other guests. And it makes you think, what will it take to overturn this kind of hierarchy then, because cruise ships certainly didn't create that kind of inequality, but it's such a microcosm. And you see that a natural disaster doesn't actually upturn that kind of inequality, right? So my goodness, that normalcy is really creepy.
Yeah, the only time that the hierarchical structure is upended a little bit is the meal, where the crew and the passengers eat together. But there's still the absurdity, the attachment to capitalism about the people, about the preparation of that food. It wasn't like, Wonder Bread or whatever was handed out and everyone
And also we lined up together, and then as soon as we got the food, the crew members and passengers kind of magically separated, right?
Yeah.
Or when we docked and the CEO turned up and he was greeted like a hero, like a Greek mythical hero. And it was just, you're right. I really don't have anything intelligent to say about that other than that it's just really striking. And it's that sense of kind of disbelief I try to convey in the passenger as well, that my gosh, like, isn't this an absurd world we're living in, where we create this floating complexes of hundreds or even thousands of rooms with swimming pools and buffets and, you know, in some cases like roller coasters, and then ship them out there into the middle of this element where we have zero chances of survival without this modern technology, and let's see what happens, you know.
Yeah. And the fact that people can still use their cell phones and FaceTime the husband back in the States. That's
right.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's both like amazing in a good way too, right? Look what we have achieved, right? And also kind of head scratching, like, wow, like we've evolved this far, and this is what we came up with, you know? This is what we're doing. Yeah, I'm not torn on cruises per se. I'm just really weirded out by cruises.
Yeah.
And, not to be a hypocrite, I've been on them, and I see their appeal. They're so comfortable if you're not the one who's working,
right? Right. Well, I mean, you say near the end of the book, I don't think this is giving anything away, that you will never go on a cruise again. Do you still feel attached to that idea, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, ask me again when I have like mobility issues or what have you, knock on wood. But fact of the matter is that I've been kind of called out by a fellow freelance writer that I seem to be very disparaging towards, luxury travelers and luxury writers, quote unquote. I don't know what that is, luxury writer, writers, luxury. But the point was that by writing about crew members and the disparities, I was sort of breaking this code of honor among travel writers, as if, right? And fine, if you're going to go on a cruise and not see any of that and not write about any of that, that is a political choice as much as it is to write about them. The sheer absence of labor in when you write about travel, if you choose not to acknowledge that, then you're either utterly blind to that or you're choosing not to. But either way, that is a political statement, I think.
Right.
So in that regard, I would have a really hard time going back to a cruise because, again, cruises aren't any more evil or what have you than the rest of the world. But by, faced with that kind of disparity, like in this confined space, I don't know if I can relax again,
Right. That there's something so affecting about that moment when you walk down the hall and there are all those men sitting in a space where they wouldn't usually be seen, outside of the passengers' rooms, and
they're never allowed in the passenger areas, and the only reason why they were there was because all the passengers weren't allowed to go up there. So the point was to keep them invisible, right? Continue to keep them invisible. If you think about it, like the way this kind of system perpetuates itself despite natural disasters, it makes me kind of fear for our future in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But all in all, again, not to be a hypocrite, I had it super easy. I was one of the passengers, so that I was fed, I was warm the whole time. I didn't have to risk my life. A sobering thought, really, and now I get to write a book about it.
Right. don't know why that made me think about the character of your mother in the book, and there's that moment in which I guess she and your father believe you've already been taken off the boat and rescued,
right.
but in fact you're still there, and your mother's furious because the older people were taken off, and she said they've already lived their lives.
And that's the kind of shade she likes to cast. The cruise company made a mistake and it called my parents and said, your son's been evacuated, so he's fine. I don't know how that happened. So they texted me and I said, haha, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Who gets to go first? I don't know. I had, that scene from the Titanic where that guy is like snatching a baby to like get on a life raft. And it's an interesting idea to think about how we assign value to personal, lives as well. Because with the pandemic, for instance, right, we started with our most vulnerable population and made our way down. In theory, anyway, there are certainly a lot of underserved communities that didn't benefit from that. But at least in theory, I think we'd like to think that a civilized society must cater to the weak first. But if my dad were to have a say, he actually is always during the pandemic, he kept saying, it's the young people who should get vaccinated first. They're the productive members, and, they should let us old people just die off. And I thought, that's morbid. I'm
going to just remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to pass those questions on to Chaney. I was thinking about this as a book about learning to be alone. One of the most, poignant thoughts around that is, I wrote this sentence down, and there's no loneliness greater than the kind you feel when you're surrounded by hundreds and thousands of others.
And that's the product of this cruise and also the pandemic lockdown.
Right.
I think many of us, I certainly felt that during the pandemic, where I live in a crowded city and surrounded by literally hundreds of people within one block. But, there's a loneliness that's so different than when you're out in wilderness or, literally by yourself physically. It is a book about being alone and also being okay with it.
Yeah.
One of the most lasting images from my trip was seeing these farmhouses on remote peninsulas and islands where you couldn't see any other human around, and probably they never see more humans than when they see a cruise ship pass by, right? What does it feel to live through a winter in that place where you have days and days of darkness with no other human company? We'd like to, we say that we're social animals, but I do wonder actually if that's necessarily the case. There's something really fortifying and empowering about being alone. And I wanted to convey that in The Passenger.
Yeah. Looks like we have some questions. I like this one. So Chaney, who do you want to play you in the movie limited series version of your book?
I mean, at this point, anybody really, just if you turn it into a movie, just anybody. But I joked earlier on that it should be Jessica Chastain just because I really like her and I look like her. I don't know, but I would hope that because we've come a long way since the days of Yellowface and, all that hopefully it would be someone who could represent some of the heritages that I mentioned in the book, not for the sake of optics, but because it would be kind of a shame to lose that. So much of the book is informed by my family history. So.
Right. Great. see, there's another one, and this is from Maddie, who says, Chaney, loved your point about how choosing not to write about or see labor is a political choice. Is labor something you're interested in examining more in future travel writing?
That's a really difficult question because in theory, yes, but I also feel very unqualified to do so. Just because I think I don't know what it's like to work in the hospitality industry as a worker. And putting on that persona for the sake of writing would be like drag. And as much as I love drag, I don't think that's really fair. Well, let me put it this way. I would love to read more of that. Whether I'm the right person to write it, I'm not so convinced. So that's a great question.
It is a great question. Thanks, Maddie. Have you started another book? Who's next?
How many books have I started that, just kind of sputtered off? So I see my editor he jumped in, he joined the call. He taught me to say that I have a next great American novel just sitting in my drawer. But fact of the matter is that no, I don't. And I'm constantly trying, but who knows what that's going to yield to. So I'm working on a few things, but whether they're going to be a book or books, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Oh, here's Michael Lowenthal. Hey, Michael. The book is called The Passenger, but I think a lot of its power is about your recognition that you can and should take the wheel and captain your own life, which is also, of course, what a writer does when he tells a story. Any thoughts on being a passenger versus being a captain, and how that might play in your ideas about narrative? It's a great question.
It's an amazing question. And of course, Michael, put it in such an eloquent and beautiful way, and I'm just going to sound like an idiot. I just want to just repeat what he asked and claim it as my idea. But no, yeah, you're right. I mean, The Passenger is an interesting title. And like many other freelancers, I am terrible at titles, in part because I think I spent the last decade turning in copy and making peace with the fact that the editors will just run with whatever headline and deck they come up with. So that side of my brain's completely wasted away. I like the idea of that, being more in control and of my own destiny, and also playing more of an active role. And that also involves then acknowledging my own culpability in storytelling. I think nonfiction leaves casualty. And that's just an unfortunate side effect of telling a story about more than just yourself. And hopefully, even the most self-possessed memoir will feature other people as well. And you might end up, hurting people inadvertently.
I've never heard anyone say leaves casualty, and it just pierced me because it's something that I think about all the time in relationship to work in this genre.
Yeah, I mean, by
come to
staying
the page with the best intentions, and honestly, you don't know how it's going to be received, and you're only writing, a filament of a life.
Mm-hmm.
And human life is so much broader than that. And like, how do you write the filament with respect? And how do you write about the self without writing about all the selves around us who make us who we are?
And also by extension, right? The self is an extension of your loved ones. You are the negative space of all those people who populate your life. And I have to acknowledge that and come clean with that as well. So this is a very, inarticulate way of saying, yes, I would love to be the captain of my own narrative, knowing that I'm leaving a wake of, casualty. And yeah, I don't know. I'm still making peace with that, I suppose.
Yeah. It's also like making peace with what one can't control, right?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, and not much, right? That's
Yeah.
the whole point of the passenger, which is that there's a whole sequence of serendipity and coincidence that lead to this thing that we call destiny or history or what have you, right? This is what happened, but if you look back, it's just a series of random occurrences beyond most people's control. And we like to assign some sort of a retroactive narrative saying this happened because of this person's decision and that, but there's so much more to it than that. And oftentimes that is really random, right? But yeah, so that's what the book's about. And also I talk about how my heart just swells with this idea in this auditorium after the ordeal that, hey, all these people, over 1,000 people, are going to walk away from this with a different story. We're all going to have a very different version of the story. And how amazing is that? It's almost heartwarming too. I guess going back to that idea of casualty, it absolves you of that sin as well in some ways, because yours is but one of many, many stories being told. So
Yeah. I mean, one of the loveliest things about the book is its recognition of interconnectedness. So, in part, it's about contending with and learning to walk with one's aloneness, but that sits with the story of all the other people who, as I said in my blurb, make one's life possible.
yeah, and I cried when I got your blurb, by the way. It just meant so much to
That
be
makes me happy.
understood. Yes, it makes you happy to make some person you've never met in person cry.
Well, yeah,
Yes.
it was a fun one to write because I really wanted to. I loved the book so much, and I wrote it right away afterward. And it was I wanted to. I felt like I'd been moved by that notion of interconnection and the very specific way you represented it.
And yeah, that human butterfly effect that we'll never even come to reconcile with, just by our existence, where we've set off so many like domino tiles around, right? And we have no idea where the tiles are falling. But we're also the byproduct of other people's tiles. And I love that, actually, as much as I've been accused of being a cynic and I've been accused of being a pessimist, but I also like being part of that chain of humanity, begrudgingly.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like the speaker or like the version of you in the page will say, I might be a cynic or I might be jaded, but there's so many moments of earnestness and vulnerability and candor that, I mean, the latter three feel like truest to the essence of the book to me.
Thank you. And again, going back to that vulnerability and being naked, right? It takes a lot to be seen, and it is still scary. And to know that this book is going to have its own life is scary, but I have to move on, it's going to have its own life.
Is this? I hope this is not a redundant question, but I was wondering. I bet you've been asked this. Like, so how is The Passenger timely? You refer to COVID in the final section of the book, but my gut sense is that it's timely in a much more cellular way than that.
Interesting. I'll have to think a little more about that, but I happen to belong to a really small book group of 4 writers. We like to call ourselves the Avon Ladies. And we read Catherine Ann Porter at one point during the pandemic, and we were actually kind of marveling at the fact that very little was written about the Spanish flu. And I don't know what the COVID pandemic will leave behind, but I certainly hope that we will examine this time some more. I didn't want to write a book that's temporary. but I definitely wanted to leave a chronicle of this really strange time we've lived through. And again, The Passenger wasn't a book until I recast the whole experience through this bizarre, lonely / crowded experience of being locked down in a city. Whether that's gonna withstand the test of time or not is none of my business. But I'd like to think that
we
it
write
was
toward, right?
I'm sorry?
That's what we write toward.
Yeah,
It's a mistake not to reach for that. It's more than a mistake. It's like that's.
I mean, yeah, I'd like to hope so. I mean, like, trees had to die for this, like it better, like something better come out of it, and I really hope that this captures a certain moment that needs to be captured, So
you are a teacher at Stanford, and I wonder how does teaching nonfiction or any literature inform the way you think about writing?
I feel like such an imposter calling myself that in front of you. And, Michael Lowenthal, who's in the audience, was among my first writing teachers and, among the best I've ever had. I teach things like travel writing, and I hope that I practice what I preach, but I can't guarantee that I do. And I don't know what my former students think of this book, but does that inform what I do? In some ways, I try to do the things that I implore my students to do. And I also make sure to tell them, I'm really all for breaking conventions, and you have to break conventions to evolve. But in order to do that, you have to learn the conventions first, which is why I teach all sorts of travel writing cliches and, conventional structures. I drill the whole nut graph into their brains just because I feel like if they want to subvert that, then they better know how to do a good nut graph. So I'd like to hope that I broke a lot of my own rules that I teach. I hope I did, but I don't know. Yeah, it's been just kind of a crazy experience, going from the pandemic to putting this out there into the world, that I haven't really had a chance to think about this objectively, and I don't know if I ever will.
Yeah, well, it's such an odd time for all. I mean, the narrative is that we're post-pandemic, and it's so much more complicated than that.
Really is.
I feel like, we're sort of pretending, many of us who are lucky enough to be vaccinated and live in parts of the US where we can be vaccinated, are pretending everything's okay. And I feel like it's the past, 15 months have really corkscrewed into our psyches.
Yeah.
That we'll be living with for years and years and years. Yeah. I've seen people change wildly over the last year.
Myself included, yeah. And the nosy side of me is so giddy at the idea of just finding out what happens, what crazy things that we end up doing, how damaged we are, I really want to see. But the other side of me is really sad that, we've been permanently damaged by this experience. Then again, you and I get to have this chat, online.
Exactly. Which
was unthinkable 2 years ago, right? So I love it. And then all these people came to tune in. Thank you so much. Because we weren't doing this 2 years ago,
Yeah, or, I think we all started in March of 2020. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's still a very new thing.
Yeah. Well, the experience on the cruise ship that I described in The Passenger has altered the course of the rest of my life. And I think the lockdown has for every single one of us here. Mm-hmm. And it's what we make of it. I hope people leave good records of it, though.
Yeah.
So
I do too. Thank you so much, Chaney. This was great. I loved talking to you. And thank you to Greenlight for being such great hosts. Katie's back.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you so much for that fantastic discussion. And thanks everybody for joining us. If you have not gotten your copy of The Passenger yet, please do. You can buy it in-store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. If you missed any of tonight's event, or if you just want to watch it again, we will be posting the recording to our YouTube channel, so please look out for it there. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Greenlight. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Chaney.
Bye.